Hey there. My name is Simon Owens. I'm a tech and media journalist, and with me today I have my good friend Bill Beutler. Hey, Bill, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, Simon. Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. Let's see. I am Bill Beutler, as you've ably conveyed. I am the founder and president of Beutler Ink. It is a digital marketing agency based in Washington, D.C., with a team around the country. And I am also. I know I'm here today where we're talking about the iPad. I am an Apple. Let's just go ahead and say fanboy from way back. So my Apple and my iPad credentials are strong. I can detail them as we get into
So,
the
so you,
conversation.
uh, yeah, you're one of those people. You will watch an Apple keynote from beginning to end. Maybe not live always, but you'll watch a recorded version. You read Daring Fireball at least once a day, and I've always known you. Whenever Apple releases a new product, you're usually one of the first people to order it. That'd be correct.
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy every single thing straight up, but I will give everything strong consideration. So, I don't have, for example, those Apple AirPods, partly because I already have a Bluetooth headset that works fine. But as soon as it dies, then I will switch to the Apple AirPods for sure.
Perfect. So that's perfectly queued up for what I wanted to talk about today. So I'm pulling up this. Hopefully the screen share works. Just one second.
Hmm.
Um, so we're going to start with this chart. So we're going to specifically be talking about the iPad, and I think this is a debate that I don't know if you remember. That's something that you and I have had debates about in the past. Is what function the iPad has had within Apple in terms of a product that it's offering. So obviously the iPhone was this revolutionary device. It just in terms of Apple's its value as a company, it completely exploded after that. And I would contend that the brilliance is that Steve Jobs took this device that everybody had to have anyway, which was a phone, and he turned it into a computer. So since they already had to have it anyway, then they could just simply upgrade to this much more sophisticated device and have access to the internet through it. And suddenly we went to from having only access to the internet when we were sitting down at our desk to this other device that gave us access to the internet anytime we were not at the desk. So it just, in terms of actual overall internet use, it just exploded. And if you see charts about internet use, you see that desktop has stayed pretty consistent over time. Like it hasn't really shrunk at all in terms of time spent on the internet in front of your desktop. Where the explosion in internet uses happened is through the mobile phone. Like it really just extended the number of hours that people were accessing the internet. And then, as you know, in the early tens, the early what do we call this decade? I don't know. Uh, uh,
Teams.
yes, Apple released the iPad, and something that I could never really figure out, and something that I've always contended was that the iPad always felt like something that was a solution in search of a problem that didn't really exist. And what I mean by that is that um, we have this device, the desktop or the laptop, for when we're at our desk, and we have this thing called the iPhone or smartphone from whenever we're away from the desk. And I just never thought that the iPad had any kind of utility much beyond that. Like where did the iPad fit into all this to justify its cost of $600-700? And whenever I kind of put this to iPad defenders, they were always like, oh, it's great to use when you're on the couch, or it's great when you're in bed. And to me, that just always just felt like really unconvincing because I could still use my iPhone in bed, and I could still use that on the couch. In fact, that's normally what I do. And I just don't think that the iPad brought that much extra utility. And lately, I've got to say that I've felt pretty vindicated. So if you look at this chart here on the screen, it shows iPad sales, and you can see this kind of initial rush of sales as all the kind of Apple fanboys, the people who are going to buy Apple products no matter what, rush to buy it. But then you see it quickly kind of falling off. You see all these peak sales that happen around Christmas getting lower and lower, and then the off-season ones getting lower and lower and well. So it seems I at least feel vindicated. Maybe during this conversation you're going to say otherwise. but we're seeing a sharp decline, and we're seeing kind of, I feel like Apple grasping at straws, trying to release several different versions of the iPad, different screen sizes, and then trying to launch this completely new device, which they're calling, a laptop replacement, the iPad Pro. I haven't been enticed to go out and buy one. Obviously, I do have an iPad. I hardly ever use it. My wife uses it here. Let me go back to the regular screen. My wife uses it when she's cooking and has her recipes up on it. But I just don't think that the utility is there. So I don't know. What do you think in terms of my opening salvo of the iPad's utility, and whether I don't know, Apple didn't really release a must-have device?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so certainly I remember our conversations around the time the iPad came out, and no doubt I was more bullish on its success than you were. And look, if you look at the first half of that chart, you do see incredible sales growth for the first about 3 years of the iPad's existence. And so it certainly is a compelling device as regards what it is good for. The question, and I acknowledge that clearly it has fallen off. Sharp is debatable. I mean, it's been a steadier glide down. I think as everybody who wants one has one, and they found that the iPad they have is pretty good. Like, you don't necessarily need to buy one every couple of years the way that people are compelled to buy phones. People take phones everywhere with them. They frequently drop them. They crack all the time. And being smaller, they have less battery, and so the battery declines more. Declining battery on an iPad is noticed less because they tend to be less portable. Those are all kinds of things. They do, however, want to. So we don't disagree in terms of what our eyeballs tell us in terms of the sales numbers. But you did just describe a way that it fits into your household, even if you're not using it personally. I mean, my question really would be, you're comparing it to what? You're comparing it to the iPhone? Because every single other product on the face of this planet Earth pales in comparison to the iPhone. And the iPad is a multi-billion-dollar business, just one that has seen some, I would say, modest decline in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if this were like 1 or 2 years ago, I'd be agreeing with you. But now that we're seeing that the iPhone sales are kind of stagnating, in some cases actually dropping, I don't know. I think questions like this have a renewed significance, wouldn't you say? Because iPad, or the Apple, which is beholden to shareholders and is constantly needing to increase revenue, increase profit to justify its existence. With iPhones kind of stalling out, they kind of need to have these new product categories, or these growing product categories. We saw it with the watch. iPad was one of those moonshots they were taking. We're hearing rumors of them trying to replace the TV, even talk with cars. So don't you think that makes this debate a little bit newly relevant?
I am not an Apple shareholder, and I really run this thing.
Sure, yeah.
I could give fuck all what the shareholders think about it. I care as a user of Apple devices that they continue to improve, and that they, make my work easier, and they make my, downtime more pleasant. And on the whole, of course, they do that. I have a whole separate set of complaints about Apple devices, mostly around how their services work or don't work all that well. In terms of the iPad, what are we complaining about here? Just the fact that it is no longer growing at it is no longer growing.
Mm-hmm.
Every product finds its place, and so I think it's very possible that the iPad had this huge burst out of the gate because it was just like a big iPhone, and that's actually kind of neat. And so a lot of people tried it out, and they did find uses for it, but they found that it filled a niche. So when you say that it is not a necessity, I don't disagree with that. But that is not the same thing as saying that it is not useful. And I find it useful for all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. So what do you use your iPad for?
Okay.
Is it actually replacing your laptop in any sense?
It certainly has at times, although I do not find it to be a perfect replacement for a laptop. So the devices that I currently use on my 27-inch 5K iMac. I also have a MacBook, the super light version they released a couple of years ago, that competes with my iPad. I have it here in front of me with me. My 12.9-inch iPad Pro that I oftentimes will keep attached to the Apple keyboard cover. I also, somewhere here, I have the Apple Pencil, which I barely use because I don't really draw. And so my uses of it are, most of the time, this thing sits at my kitchen table in a different configuration, handy to switch around. I use it to read while I'm eating. I find it a superior device for reading while I'm eating because it is a much bigger screen than my phone, and because the stand puts it in a position that's easier to read, and it doesn't have that keyboard right there where my food could splash onto it. I also, if I'm being good, I spend 30 to 45 minutes on the treadmill every morning. And so I will detach the iPad and I will read The Economist's audio edition, or The Economist's iPad, while I'm listening to the audio edition. And so that kind of keeps me from having to think about the fact that I'm exercising. I also use it for light work in the evening, like when I'm in front of the TV and I've got something on Netflix or a sports game that I don't really need to pay super close attention to. I'll put it back into the kind of laptop format, and I will do email. I'll organize my to-do list. The experience of doing that on an iPad versus on the laptop is maybe it's subtle, and I'm somebody who cares more about having devices than the average person. I'm willing to spend money on these subtle differences. But most people don't have a second laptop either, so they'll choose. I find that the iOS, the software that powers the iPad, to be there's less clutter, a smoother experience. It's more focused, and I think that I have brought it with me on work trips.
Well, that was my next question. If you're going to a cafe or something, are you bringing and you're planning on working? Are you bringing your laptop or are you bringing your iPad?
Most of the time, I'm bringing my MacBook. That's true. It kind of go back and forth. It sort of depends on mood, how I'm feeling. I realize that's a pretty like privileged thing to say. Like not everybody has these two devices to choose from. Most people choose one and stick with it for a long time. Like I have brought my iPad Pro with me on work trips in the past. I did not. And look, I have my own complaints, about what it's like to use an iPad for work purposes. So, for example, last fall I went to a conference where I was giving a presentation, and I had the template for a presentation built in Keynote before I left, but I knew that I was going to finish it. I planned to finish it in the hotel room before I gave it. So Keynote on iPad is nice, being able to manipulate the around with my fingers rather than having to use a mouse or a trackpad. Two problems that I ran into. One is that it's too hard to do some things and it's impossible to do others. So the workflow on an iPad to add images to a document, if you want to, have like a browser next to you so you can read while you're typing. That's more difficult for sure. In Keynote, this is a real minor thing, but I found out that I could not edit master slides in the iPad Keynote. That was only possible and so I had to come up with a workaround. So, there are trade-offs. Trade-offs.
Well, one thing that you mentioned was that it's kind of like a large iPhone, and I wonder if Samsung with launching these phablets a few years ago, if that really kind of even narrowed down the use case of the iPad even more, because obviously Apple was then forced to start coming out with larger and larger screens, and the largest version of the iPhone is so large now that I like whatever utility that the iPad easier reading experience, I think I could get just like I feel like on the larger, especially the larger iPhone, I could now read a book or a magazine, and it'd be a pretty pleasurable experience. Do you think that the expanding screens on phones are squeezing the iPad's potential market even more?
Yeah, I think it's probable. And yesterday, this week, Apple WWDC keynote, they made no mention whatsoever of the iPad Mini. It seems plausible that they are discontinuing it, and the people who want a bigger iPhone screen. So I plumped for the plus size this last time, which is still a good deal smaller than a Mini. I used to have a Mini, but I don't have it any longer. Mini size is definitely a casualty. The iPad itself, the larger size is the 9.7 that's been around for a while, the 12.9 that came out recently, and now the 10.5 announced this week. I don't think that those are comparable to. These are very, very different things, right?
Yeah.
I would not work. I would not do sustained work on my iPhone. I'll do very light email, but most of the time I'll just look at the email and I will, I'll flag it for follow up later on.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who you use the iPad way more than I do, so you have more access, and talk a little bit about you sent me an article from Ben Thompson of Stratechery about how it treats its developers. What do you think about the iPad apps, and how is that in terms of impacting its potential market growth and sellability in terms of creating an actual differentiated product from the iPhone that people will want to buy, like in terms of how good its apps are and how good it is at getting developers to create really true native apps for it?
Right. Actually, before I just go back to some of those workflow issues that I mentioned as being, being a problem for me, because I do think on Monday Apple addressed. Who knows whether they're going to make a master sliding keynote. That's a trivial thing in the big picture. However, in terms of the difficulty of the workflow, in terms of being able to switch apps and being able to move information from one to another, I would recommend the iPad iOS 11 keynote, because the features that they announced for it, I found them to be, I'm looking forward to them very much, and it will make me think again about going back to try the iPad as a laptop. So one thing that they're doing is the dock at the bottom of the screen to include many apps like on a Mac, and also you'll be able to interact with that dock from within apps. So you can call up other apps and move them to the side. So the multi-screen capability has gotten to be much better. On top of that, they now actually have brought drag and drop to the iPad. So you can drag a URL from one to another. You can grab multiple images and drop them into an email. On top of that, even better, maybe from my actual workflow perspective, there is a new system called Files, which actually shows in folders, which is something that I think a couple years ago probably did predict that would never come to the iPad, since Apple was so invested in this idea of apps first and files being through them. This is a huge difference. I keep almost everything that matters to me lives in Dropbox or lives in Google Drive. The fact that I can now open up a folder on the internet and drag files out of Dropbox into whatever I'm writing in, that's really big. That's huge. So looking forward to all that.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's getting closer to being a laptop. It's getting closer to being a laptop replacement, is what you're saying.
I do think it took a big jump with that, or will take a big jump with that in iOS 11, and that I think that's going to be big. Yeah. This is all like Apple is getting better at making apps for itself, for its own, for iPad. But yeah, let's move on to what you asked about the problem with the App Store. And this, as you mentioned, is a critique that I know best from a newsletter called Stratechery, which is a paid subscription newsletter. But if you follow this space as closely as I do, it is it's a bargain at the $9.99 a month. And so his argument is that the App Store itself is a terrible platform for developers. That Apple has created the wrong incentive structure for how to monetize apps. Now, on the iPhone, where most apps are sold, apps are monetized either through advertising, and that oftentimes not a good experience. Crummy services and crummy experience when they pop up and they get in your way. The second way that they get monetized is through in-app purchases. So people got mad earlier this year when the new Super Mario game came out for the iPhone. Play like, I don't know, 3 levels, and then it said pony up $10. So people got mad about that. $10? No one could ever buy a Mario game for $10 previously. That is, people's expectations have been adjusted, and that's Apple's fault. That they have, like the average selling price of an app in the App Store for iPhone or for iPad has declined. Where in the early days it was possible to sell a good app for $10. There's a handful that sell for even more, but those are a rare breed. They're like unicorns themselves. Most of them are free, and most of them are games. Unsurprisingly, games are the biggest seller out there. That's for the iPhone. The same thing exists for the iPad, but there's no reason why sell better on the iPad. Like that doesn't work as well on the iPad. Potentially could be really good for a laptop replacement, but it doesn't have the kind of software that it needs. It's not as powerful, it's not updated as frequently, and this again has to do with the incentives that Apple did poorly. So while one can do in-app purchases, one cannot do a free trial, the sort that is regularly offered on desktop software to give users an experience of using it before saying, hey, thank you very much, your free trial period is over. If you like this, please buy it. And that works. That works. The other one that is a bigger deal, I would argue, is there's no upgrade pricing. So if I buy your app one time, and let's say a year later you release you have a much better version of it ready to roll, to actually monetize that is to release it as a whole second app. And there's really no way to easily get people it's not incentivizing people to develop quality apps that they can build a real business around. And it's very frustrating. I'm not a developer, so it's only frustrating for me as a user, but I think there are a lot of would-be developers who have given up or never even started in the first place because they can't build business around it.
Aren't these easy fixes for Apple though?
Would be. I do not know why they're not doing it, and it's a matter of great consternation to, the people who follow this space closely. Besides Stratechery, another great source of commentary on Apple is a podcast called the Accidental Tech Podcast, or ATP. It's at atp.fm, so we can go find it. And they are, all of the 3 hosts are all themselves developers. One of them is a developer of the popular apps Overcast, which is a podcast application, and the Instapaper, no longer controls, but these are people who really know these guys, of course.
Yeah. Speaking of Instapaper, I've had it like on my iPad, and I've had an account for years, but I finally started using it religiously just a few weeks ago, and it's just a lifesaver in terms of not having 50 tabs open at once and being able to slowly, methodically go through articles that I've meant to read. It's just completely changed my entire browsing practices for the better. Anyway, speaking of developers, would you say that like Apple for years has kind of treated developers like redheaded stepchildren. Like you've heard complaints going back years that they just do not take them seriously, and there's always those delays, and they always acted like they didn't need them. And I was listening to a great podcast called Encrypted by Bloomberg, and they've talked about how that's finally all changing. That once the iPhone sales started stalling, all of a sudden Apple needed to start making more money on their services category, and all of a sudden they started being super nice to developers. They started rolling out all these new agreements and stuff that were much more generous for the developers. So do you think like kind of the tide is turning in terms of them listening to the developer community, and that this might have a positive impact also on the iPad as well?
Slowly. I do think it is possible that Apple will see the light in terms of offering free trials and upgrade pricing. There's no reason that I'm aware of or that I've heard anybody else say that they can't do it. Early on, when they wanted to keep it simple, I could see why they didn't. But heck, if you look at iOS 11, the iPad is no longer simple. You know, the market is ready for complexity. In fact, it's overdue for it. I don't agree with the, say, redheaded stepchild, but I think that's how they treat developers. But they do. There is sort of a schizophrenic approach, though. You know, at WWDC stands for Worldwide Developers Conference, which Apple every year they have a lottery for the developer to develop for the App Store and for the Mac Store. It's wildly popular. Like I said, it's a lottery, so it's not easy to get into it. And they throw a big party, a week-long, conference out in. They used to do it in San Francisco. Right now, this week they did it in San Jose, and throw a big old party for developers. They love developers, but they also love them, in their own way. And so, I think they have, they have created this app store that did not exist previously and has, made it possible for create a living that they had not ever before. However, that not unlike the iPad, it had this super fast growth, and it matured. How like rising tides lift all boats, and then the receding tide reveals all. As the tide has gone down, it's become clear that there are only certain types of apps that really make money. And there are, like right now, I would never consider, I have thought about making an app, but never to make money because that is extremely difficult to break into. It's as hard as writing a novel and getting it published, selling a screenplay. Writing a hit app is just as difficult as those.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to move into the final segment for this, and so at the beginning I said that I couldn't imagine what the iPad could replace. Like with the iPhone, what I said was it was brilliant because it replaced the phone that people already had. But I guess it was a little bit disingenuous because there is something that it could replace, something that millions of Americans spend hours doing every single week, and that's reading long form content. So replacing both magazines and even more importantly books. Like magazines are a huge multi-billion-dollar industry. Same thing with books. They're not easy to read. Neither of those things are easy to read on phones. So it seemed like the iPad or any kind of tablet would be the perfect kind of replacement for that. But as we saw in kind of lots of reporting, like we saw a lot of magazines really early on, Condé Nast, News Corp, they went long. They invested a lot of money in developing these very beautiful apps. Obviously, there was a huge ramp up in kind of the ebook market, which I think Amazon gets a lot of credit for creating out of whole cloth with the launch of the Kindle. But most of those magazines, they didn't see any kind of return on investment. And ebook sales, Amazon still has well over 60% of all ebook sales. And after we've seen like all these sharp inclines with ebook sales over years, they've kind of leveled out, and we've actually seen a reversal as people are returning to print books. So I wonder why the iPad wasn't able to kind of really dominate that niche. Do you think it has to do, like, it was just because it's just too expensive, and if you're going to have an ebook reader, it's better to just get like a cheaper tablet, something that Amazon is running? I mean, was that just kind of a lost cause? Like, we still just love reading long form on print.
I think you make a good point about the price of an e-reader. So I also own a Kindle Paperwhite, and I use it a few times a week. When I buy books, I tend to buy them for the Kindle Paperwhite, and it's been a couple of years since I have read a book that I bought from the iBook store. I have occasionally used the Kindle app, my iPad, especially when I'm on the treadmill. I would say, I do think the bigger thing here is not so much a fault of the iPad per se, but is because Amazon is already the place where you go to buy books and really buy most everything. I think, what, 37% of American households have Amazon Prime now. You are already used to the, let's say, to use this word again, the workflow, as it were, of going to Amazon and buying a book. And so the Amazon, pretty smooth experience to buy that Kindle and to use it. And you have to do more work to get it onto the iPad. Also, you have to, no one thinks about just going to the iBook store unless you purposefully are choosing to do that. Amazon, you're already at Amazon, you're buying toilet paper and, like home supplies, cat food. And then while you're there, oh, hey, the new Stephen King book is out. So how about I get that? So I think that's a much bigger deal. Amazon controls on e-commerce, and a lot more complicated than that.
Interesting. Okay, well, Bill, those were all the questions I had. Thanks so much for joining us and giving us some insight into your expertise.
Thank you very much. This is fun. We'll do it again.
And where can people find you?
Oh, let's see. People can find me on Twitter as @WilliamBeutler. They can find my company, Beutler Ink, as it's also @Beutler Ink on Twitter. But BeutlerInk.com is our site, and come have a look. We have all kinds of fun projects that we've done. That's me. I'm on the internet. I'm all over in other places too, but we'll stick with those for now.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, and thanks everybody for listening in. Really appreciate it. This is the first of, I hope, of many Google Hangout interviews I'm going to be doing, so hopefully it was entertaining.